He didn't leave behind a note, a body, or a goodbye. Only a truck parked by the edge of a frozen river. 1 year later, his 3 daughters were discovered lying side by side in their home. Lifeless but untouched. No blood, no bruises, no signs of struggle. Their hands were clasped together. Their eyes were closed. They looked more asleep than dead. No one heard them scream. No one saw who came. But something, or someone, had been there. And it never truly left. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts, but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said. Because sometimes, the most chilling part of a crime isn't what happened, but what was allowed to happen unnoticed. Today, we explore one of those silences, an unsolved mystery wrapped in family shadows, isolation, and psychological decay. This is the story of the missing father and 3 dead daughters. It began in a place where secrets don't need to hide. They simply go unspoken. Hayworth, Michigan, a town of barely 4,000 residents surrounded by pine forest, brittle winters, and a silence thick enough to absorb suspicion. On the surface, it looked like any other rural American town, but beneath the stillness was a population bound by routine, small-town fatigue, and an unspoken agreement. Don't ask too many questions. The Lane family moved here in 2009, hoping for peace. Instead, they brought a war with them. Richard Lane was a 48-year-old Army veteran who served 2 combat tours in Iraq. After returning home in 2006, he was medically discharged due to a combination of physical injury and what his file cryptically called prolonged psychological symptoms. Those symptoms, of course, had a name: post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But in Hayworth, people preferred simpler words: quiet guy, odd but respectful. Kept to himself, he worked part-time at a local auto repair shop, spent most of his hours in the garage behind the house, and rarely joined town events. He was polite but unreachable, like a radio set to the wrong frequency. His wife, Helen, died of pancreatic cancer in 2012. She had been the family's center of gravity, a stabilizing presence amid Richard's internal turbulence. When she passed, the fragile equilibrium of the Lane household collapsed. Richard changed almost overnight. According to neighbors, he boarded up the windows in the girls' bedrooms for security, stopped answering the door unless it was a known face, and began installing locks on the inside of every room. The Lane daughters, Clara, 21, June, 18, and Emily, 16, had been typical children once: bike rides, school plays, community center dances. But that changed quickly after Helen's death. Clara dropped out of college. June left the high school soccer team without explanation. Emily stopped attending school altogether and was later homeschooled. Their world shrank to a single house on the edge of the forest. Still, they kept up appearances, grocery runs, doctor visits, church every other Sunday. But those close enough to notice saw changes, small things at first. Clara, the eldest, began walking with a slight stoop, as if perpetually bracing for something. June grew withdrawn, barely responding to peers. Emily rarely made eye contact. Then there were the screams. One neighbor, who later requested anonymity, claimed to hear what sounded like nightmares coming from the house. Another said they saw Richard yelling at no one in the yard. Police were never called, no formal complaints, just whispers. Whispers that eventually stopped, not because the noise did, but because no one wanted to be the one who disturbed the fragile silence. That it's important here to pause and ask, what keeps people silent? In psychology, this is known as pluralistic ignorance, when individuals privately reject a norm but assume others accept it, leading to collective inaction. In Hayworth, no one wanted to believe something was wrong in the Lane house, so everyone agreed, wordlessly, not to act. We now know more. Richard's military records, obtained after his disappearance, revealed severe PTSD symptoms, night terrors, disassociation, hypervigilance, and periods of paranoid delusion. One report described him as detached from reality under prolonged stress. He had once insisted that his commanding officer had implanted a chip in his neck. His VA psychiatrist noted, patient demonstrates trauma-fueled need for control and isolation. Protective instinct distorted into potential risk to dependence. And then there were the journals. After the girls' deaths, police found Clara's handwritten journal under a floorboard. In it, she wrote, "Dad is trying. But we're tired. Sometimes I think he thinks we're soldiers he left behind." Another passage, barely legible, said simply, "He talks to Mom at night. Sometimes we hear her talk back." What do we do with a man like Richard Lane? A soldier, a father, a patient, a protector who may have become the threat that it's tempting to draw a straight line from trauma to tragedy, but that would be too easy and too dishonest. Richard Lane was not simply a man broken by war. He was a man reassembled incorrectly by everything that came after: grief, isolation, stigma, and the unbearable pressure of trying to stay strong for 3 daughters who were crumbling in front of him. As for the girls, they weren't just victims, they were survivors, day after day, until they weren't. Each responded differently. Clara assumed the role of second mother. June became the peacekeeper. Emily, the youngest, retreated inward. Her therapist, who saw her for 3 sessions in 2016, noted a flat effect, recurring dreams of drowning, and an almost obsessive interest in silence. There's a psychological term for the kind of surrender that doesn't make a sound. Learned helplessness, the quiet belief that no matter what you do, nothing will ever change. It doesn't come all at once, it creeps in, a missed call here, a locked door there, a whispered truth swallowed in the name of keeping peace. Over time, the Lane daughters stopped resisting, not because they gave up on life, but because they stopped believing that life would ever reach back. The Lane house remained still, always locked from the inside, surrounded by dense trees that blocked both sunlight and scrutiny. To the world, they looked intact, a grieving father, 3 quiet girls. No calls to police, no bruises, no drama, just a dim house on the edge of town. Lights out by 6, dead quiet by 9. But silence is not a synonym for safety. Silence is simply what happens when fear can no longer find language, and in that silence, things don't disappear, they decay. This was the atmosphere the Lane daughters breathed every day. With their father growing more haunted by a war no one else could see, their world shrank around them, until one question remained, one they never dared speak aloud. If he comes back, will he still be our father? On January 17, 2017, Richard Lane left home for work as usual. He never arrived. His truck was found abandoned near the northern bend of White River, keys still in the ignition. The driver's seat was pulled back, as if someone had sat there for hours. No blood, no note, no tracks in the snow, just frozen silence and a parked vehicle facing the woods. Inside the truck, police found a torn page from a notebook. 5 words, written in tight handwriting. "I did what I could." That was the last physical trace of Richard Lane. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no leads. His military background, combined with Hayworth's deep terrain and frigid winters, made the search nearly impossible. By spring, the case had quietly gone cold. Home. The daughters gave no public statements, no emotional pleas. They simply continued on. Grocery runs, trash bins out on Tuesdays, porch light flickering by nightfall. To observers, it looked like resilience. To those who knew trauma, it looked like collapse held together by routine. Then came the second silence. March 14, 2018. Just after 11 a.m., a neighbor noticed something strange. The front door of the Lane house hung open by an inch. That was rare. Richard Lane had been meticulous about home security: double bolts, reinforced frames, a house locked tight, always. The neighbor hesitated. She knocked. No answer. Then, slowly, she stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. No movement, no sound. Then, in the living room, she froze. All 3 Lane daughters, Clara, June, and Emily, lay together on the main couch, not slumped, not sprawled, positioned, deliberate. Their bodies rested side by side, heads propped on pillows, fully dressed in soft sleepwear. Their hands were gently interlocked, their expressions still, no fear, no strain, just closed eyes, as if mid-dream that a lamp glowed from the corner. The television buzzed with quiet static. A single teacup sat untouched on the coffee table, still. Faintly warm. No blood. No weapons. No signs of struggle. The windows were locked. The furniture undisturbed. They looked like they had simply gone to sleep. Paramedics arrived minutes later. No pulse. No breath. All three were confirmed dead. But death, in this room, had left no fingerprints. Only stillness. The autopsy report noted no external injuries, no signs of overdose, no common poison in their systems. Heart rates had slowed to a fatal stop around the same time, somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. There were elevated levels of serotonin blockers in their bloodstreams, but not in quantities high enough to cause death. The final cause, undetermined. Not murder, not suicide, just death. The police combed through the house, room by room. What they found only raised more questions. All windows were locked from the inside. There were no footprints in the backyard snow except for the mailman's. From 2 days earlier, there was a note on the kitchen table, and signed, "It's finally quiet now." But no handwriting match could be confirmed. More unsettling was the discovery of the security system logs. According to the Lane home's wired alarm, the front door had opened briefly at 1:42 a.m., then closed again 1 minute later. That was the only recorded activity all night. The system then glitched, and from 1:45 to sunrise, it logged no data. When technicians later examined the hardware, they found the circuit board melted from the inside, no heat source, no tampering, just degraded material. Then came the voicemail that on Clara's phone was an unheard message timestamped 8:12 p.m., the night before their deaths. It was only 5 seconds long. A male voice, low and raspy, barely audible. "It's time. I'm coming home." Audio forensics would later suggest a 95% vocal match to Richard Lane, despite his official disappearance over a year earlier. The origin of the call was masked, pinged to a relay tower near Grand Traverse Bay, hours away. Investigators widened their scope, toxicology screens were rerun, neighbors interviewed. Clara's journal re-examined. One entry stood out. "Sometimes. It feels like he never left. He's in the quiet. In the house. In us." By April, the media picked up the case. Some outlets labeled it a cult-like suicide. Others speculated about carbon monoxide poisoning, though tests showed nothing conclusive. Online communities developed elaborate theories. A family pact, a shared psychosis, a military experiment gone rogue. But none of it fit. There was no manifesto, no pattern of radicalization, no history of mental illness in the daughters severe enough to indicate coordinated self-harm. Then there were the physical details. The body showed signs of temperature drop inconsistent with the room. Temperature. Their fingertips were blue, but their internal organs intact. All three died at nearly the same moment, yet without distress. Their muscles were relaxed, pupils slightly dilated. If it was poisoning, it was a compound unknown to modern toxicology. If it was suicide, it was carried out with an untraceable method. If it was murder, the perpetrator left no mark, not even DNA. The local police captain described the scene in one interview as eerily calm, like walking into a photograph taken just before the end of something. But something else lingered, something that defied forensic evidence. Multiple neighbors came forward in the days after, reporting strange occurrences from that night. Flickering lights, static on radios, even what one man claimed was a figure walking through the trees near the Lane house, long after midnight, then gone. No one had footage, no one had proof. Still, it was enough to unsettle even the most rational minds. How could 3 people die together without resistance? How could a father, missing, presumed dead, reappear only in a whisper? These weren't the kinds of questions crime scene investigators were trained to answer. But they were the questions that lingered, and they would grow louder as the investigation unfolded, not just for the police, but for a town that had learned long ago to stop asking. At first, The theory was simple, too simple. Authorities leaned toward a group suicide, peaceful, coordinated, and private. There were no wounds, no poisons detected in initial screenings, no evidence of forced entry or foul play. The scene felt too still, too arranged. For a week, the official language was no signs of criminal activity. But nothing about it felt ordinary. The father's disappearance a year earlier resurfaced. Richard Lane had vanished without a trace, leaving behind his truck, his watch, and a short note. "I tried my best." That was all. No explanation, no farewell, just absence. His name now returned, this time as a possible suspect. Yet, if he was responsible, why would he wait an entire year? And why leave behind a scene so meticulous, so untouched? Police reopened the missing persons case, expanding it into a potential multiple homicide. But they faced a frustrating lack of evidence. The security system had gone offline days before the girls were found. Surveillance footage from the block was incomplete. There were no fingerprints, no unusual DNA, just the three daughters, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Meanwhile, the media erupted, and the town began to choose sides. The case quickly became national news. A family of four, mother long deceased, father missing, daughters dead in a single day. Reporters began drawing connections that weren't there. Father returns from the shadows, one headline read. A suicide pact in slow motion. Claimed another. Sensationalism replaced precision. Online forums spun theories into myths. Some believed the family was part of a doomsday cult. Others suspected a hired killer, sent to tie up unfinished business. A few even clung to the idea that the daughters had died peacefully, by choice. That their father's absence had become a kind of spiritual pull. Amid the noise, the facts were few. Toxicology reports came back inconclusive. There were low traces of sedatives in their blood, but not enough to kill. No signs of smothering, drowning, or overdose. No trauma. No clear method. No time of death more specific than late evening. That kind of ambiguity is rare and unsettling. It gave the case an almost mythological stillness, police-focused. Briefly on Richard's military past. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Medical records confirmed he was diagnosed with severe PTSD in 2012. After his wife's death from cancer in 2014, his behavior shifted, paranoia, sleepwalking, hypervigilance. He installed cameras inside the house, then removed them. He believed the family was being watched. He once called police on his own mailbox, but still, none of it pointed to murder. Interviews with neighbors painted conflicting portraits. One described Richard as a protective father, just trying to hold it together. Another recalled hearing shouting late at night, arguments muffled behind closed windows. One neighbor swore she saw him 2 days before the girls were found, walking into the woods. Alone. No proof. No timestamp. Just another thread in a knot already too tangled to unwind. Detectives dug into the daughters' lives. Clara, the eldest, had dropped out of community college 6 months before. June, 17, had stopped attending school altogether. Emily, the youngest, was last seen outside the house over a year ago. There were no boyfriends, no close friends, no therapists, no social media updates. Nothing to suggest planning, nothing to suggest motive. What made it worse, what truly unnerved investigators, was the house itself. Nothing was out of place, beds made, dishes cleaned. The calendar still marked with reminders, groceries. Wednesday, dentist, Friday. Their lives, from the outside, had continued. Until they didn't. Public opinion splintered. Some insisted Richard Lane had returned and killed them, driven by delusion or some twisted form of mercy. Others believed the daughters had made a pact, weary from years of psychological decay. A few believed in a third party, someone close, someone invisible. But the most haunting theory was the quietest one. That the house itself, over time, had become so saturated with despair that it no longer needed violence to kill. That something in that silence had drained the will to survive. Not in a single night, but in 1,000 small moments. Until there was nothing left to hold on to. Law enforcement admitted, off record, that the case had stalled. No suspects, no timeline, no physical evidence. The only lead, a voicemail. It was discovered on Clara's old phone. Received at 2:13 a.m., the night before they were found. A male voice, low, calm, almost mechanical. I'm coming home now. No other words, no name. The number was untraceable. Burner phone, likely prepaid. Voice analysis was inconclusive. Could have been Richard, could have been anyone but for the Lane girls. Maybe that voice said everything. After that voicemail, none of their phones were used again. The town began to mourn in quiet, uneven ways. A memorial was set up outside the Lane house. Flowers, letters, drawings from classmates who barely remembered Emily, but the tribute soon faded. The story cooled, the house was boarded up, and the silence returned. By the end of that year, investigators quietly moved the Lane case into cold file storage. There were no arrests, no suspects, no criminal charges, just a box of evidence, some faded transcripts, and 3 death certificates that still read, undetermined cause. The official language was clinical, but what remained was not, because silence doesn't mean something ends. It only means the noise has gone underground. The story now lives in side glances, in the way people in town avoid that road after dusk, in children who cross the street rather than pass the Lane house, which still stands, boarded up, sagging under the weight of what happened inside. Some say they still hear faint static echoing from within when thunder rolls in. Others claim the porch light blinks on, randomly, even after the entire property was disconnected from the grid. A few whisper that the girls never meant to die. They were waiting for something, for someone. And maybe he returned, not in body, not in daylight, but in the shape of fear, in the corners of the room, in the hush that falls when his name is spoken. Richard Lane came home, and this time, he didn't leave alone. There's a psychological term for what may have happened in the Lane household, folie à trois, a shared psychotic disorder between multiple individuals, often in close, isolated environments. It's rare. It's difficult to diagnose post-mortem. But the signs, the stillness, the arrangement, the lack of resistance, suggest something deeper than simple coordination. A collective surrender, a psychological collapse that was not sudden, but slow, quiet, and complete. What makes this more disturbing is not just what happened, but how long it took to happen. The Lane daughters didn't grow up in a visibly abusive home. There were no emergency calls, no documented neglect, no reports of violence. Yet by all psychological measures, they were living inside a closed system of dysfunction, fear, and emotional paralysis. When their mother died, the family dynamic shifted. The daughters lost their emotional compass, and Richard Lane, already unwell, became both protector and threat. He was a man shaped by war, not healed by peace. His PTSD was untreated, unspoken, the kind that doesn't manifest as violence, but silence, detachment, a dissociation so profound that love becomes duty, and children become ghosts in their own home. And trauma is contagious that we think of PTSD as an individual condition, but trauma, especially unresolved, untreated trauma, spreads. It infects spaces, routines, relationships. The Lane house didn't need to be filled with shouting or bruises to be dangerous. It just needed to be filled with prolonged ambiguity, isolation, and fear of the unknown. Over time, the atmosphere becomes a world unto itself, a logic that doesn't make sense outside, but feels inevitable within. The daughters began to mirror their father's silence. They withdrew, their school attendance dropped. Friends described them as drifting and numb, not sad, not angry, just absent, and absence, when sustained, becomes identity. Here's a theory. Richard didn't kill them, not with his hands. He killed them by leaving them in a psychological labyrinth with no exits. They didn't die because he returned. They died because, deep down, they believed he never would. And when someone has been the center of your emotional gravity for so long, even in his absence, you remain orbiting his shadow. That's the devastation of emotional enmeshment. When your sense of self is so entangled with another's illness, You forget what it means to want things for yourself. You don't choose death, you just forget how to choose life. This makes the case even harder to classify. If it was suicide, it was not rational, not individual. It was fused, collective, a slow ritual shaped by years of emotional erosion. If it was murder, it was a murder of the mind, committed long before the bodies went still. From a philosophical standpoint, we can turn to Stoicism, which teaches that we suffer not because of events, but because of our judgments about them. In the Lane home, those judgments were warped by trauma. Fear became familiar, silence became safety. They didn't seek freedom because they had long ceased to believe it was possible. From a Buddhist perspective, suffering does not come from pain alone, but from our attachment to illusions, to stories we tell ourselves in order to survive. The Lane daughters may have clung to one such illusion, that their father, though broken, was still their axis. That if they waited long enough, remained quiet enough, kept the world from collapsing just a little longer, he would return, whole. This belief gave structure to chaos, a center to their spiraling world. But illusions are fragile. They don't shatter all at once. They erode. A look held too long, a birthday missed, a door that never opens. And when the illusion finally broke, whether through a realization, a dream, or a whisper passed between sisters, it took the scaffolding of their lives with it. Confucian philosophy places family as the core of moral order, a sacred hierarchy where each role is clear and each bond reinforces harmony. But in the Lane household, that order had collapsed. The father was physically absent, and even before that, emotionally vacant. With no paternal guidance, the daughters were left in limbo, without rules, without resistance. They were not rebelling, they were drifting. In Confucian terms, the household had lost its li, its ritual, its rhythm, and thus lost its ethical compass. What remained was silence, not just as a sound, but as a structure. A home hollowed out by absence, where even hope had become a kind of haunting. And yet, there's another possibility we must consider, one that rests not in philosophy, but in something far more unsettling. What if Richard Lane did come back, not as the man he once was, but as a ghost made flesh, shaped by guilt, twisted by time, undone by the echo of wars both external and internal? Perhaps one night, after a year lost to the void, he stepped through the threshold again. Perhaps he didn't need to force anything. Perhaps the daughters let him in, not because they were afraid, but because they were done waiting. Maybe they saw his return not as danger, but as closure, as a final alignment of all things broken. And maybe, in some unspoken agreement, they lay down together, his presence a grim lullaby, a silent permission to let go. But then, why no sign of struggle? Why no trace of violence, of chaos? That may be the most haunting truth. The trauma ran so deep, so long, that even death felt like structure. They didn't resist, they returned, to stillness, not escape. The case remains unsolved. No wounds, no poison, just silence. But perhaps that's the cruelty. We know what happened, we just fear naming it. Because maybe the killer wasn't a man or violence, but time itself. Years of unspoken grief, quiet as wallpaper hiding broken walls. The Lane sisters never screamed, never fled. Because death wasn't sudden, it wasn't foreign, it was familiar, it was home, and they had lived with it for years. If fear is a mirror, would you dare to look? The Lane family left behind no final words, no clear ending, only silence. A silence so complete, it became louder than any scream. In that stillness, we are forced to ask, what truly kills us? A single, violent act, or the slow erosion of meaning, of connection, of self? Some crimes leave no blood, only absence. No chaos, only stillness. But stillness, too, can be unbearable. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we don't just explore true crime. We sit with the silence it leaves behind. If this story unsettled you, it's because parts of it live in all of us. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Recommended reading. The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk. Family Murderers, The Psychology Behind, John C. Gibbs Unsolved Mysteries Podcast Archives, Season 2.